Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we shall be marking the 110th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, the biggest ethnic cleansing against Christians in history, where the Ottoman Turks were responsible for the murder of 1.5 million Armenians and other minority Christians. And today the Armenian people face genocide again at the hands of Azerbaijan. And in this programme today I'm joined by my good friend Ara Kirkorian, who's an Armenian missionary. Welcome to the programme, and it's great to have you back on the programme, Ara.
Thank you, Simon. It's wonderful to be back here again.
Excellent. Ara, we are marking in this programme the 110th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, which is the biggest massacre against Christians in history. It's committed by the Ottoman Turks during the First World War. Share with us what this anniversary means to you.
It means many things. On a personal level, it means recounting my grandmother Mary's story of the horrors that she went through twice, once as an orphan in the Armenian massacres before the genocide, and then the genocide itself when she lost her two little girls, aged 2 and 4, in the desert from starvation and thirst, and a husband who abandoned his soldier's duties, found her, and he was shot dead in front of her eyes. So it recalls that, but also for the Armenian nation itself, because it's not only what happened 110 years ago, it's what is still threatening to happen now as we speak from Azerbaijan.
Absolutely. We know in the previous Middle East reports that you shared your remarkable story, but for our viewers again, please share with us how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ.
I'll try and cut it down to a short episode, as it were. As all Armenian children, we were taken to church, and for years and years and years, always at mother's side, grandmother's side, inside the Armenian Orthodox Church. But once I started reaching the age of, should we say, freedom for teenagers and off to university, I dropped all that. And so for a number of years, I became agnostic, then aggressive atheist, if you like. And it was only when we had a young family, we started a young family in Somerset, that I came to faith. And that was because someone pretty nasty came to stay with us and tried to wreck our lives, and I just suddenly was there with Jesus on the shores of Galilee. I was blown away, and I couldn't stop reading the New Testament again and again, and it came alive to me, and it's been alive all those years, 40 years on. Amazing testimony.
And today this programme is dedicated to those who were Armenians and other Christian minorities that were massacred by the hands of the Ottoman Turks over 110 years ago in what is known as the Armenian Genocide. So this programme is dedicated in their memory and to the survivors, and also to the Armenian people like yourself, who are incredible people, who are God's testament of his faithfulness to your nation over the centuries, and the fact that your nation, Armenia, is surrounded by hostile Islamic states and is still thriving today despite the danger threats, is a kind of miracle in itself. But share with us the incredible history of Armenia, because Armenia, was the first country to adopt Christianity as the state religion back in 301 AD.
Well, I obviously have to go back even before 301 AD, because there are very well documented, not just Armenian, but from other sources, that state that Thaddeus and Bartholomew traveled from Israel, obviously in the 1st century AD, and started preaching Christianity in Armenia. Now, we have to remember that Armenia was a much larger area than it is now. But Christianity was preached during that period. But then, because Armenia was pagan, and there was Zoroastrianism and all sorts of things still going on, the dynasties, the kings did not follow Christianity until there was a king called Tiridates III, who was at that time was very ill, and there was an apostle, an Armenian apostle, Gregory the Illuminator, who actually started to preach Christianity in a more forceful way, and the king didn't like it. The king asked him to sort of worship the goddess, the Armenian goddess Anahit at the time. He refused to do it, so he had him thrown in a pit called Khorvirab, means deep pit. And there he stayed. He was looked after. An old woman took pity on him, fed him, and gave him water every day. But then she told him the story about the king's sickness. So the Apostle Krikor, Lusavoric, the enlightener, said he'd pray for him, whether he actually was taken to the king and met him. But the story is not that clear. But anyway, the king was healed, and as a miracle, of course, and he then declared Christianity as a nation's religion and had all the temples and everything destroyed. So that was 301 AD.
Amazing, amazing. And also share with us how the Armenian people have been living in their ancestral homeland that predates the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad and Islam, and of course the Ottoman Empire, responsible for the Armenian Genocide.
Well, it's very interesting to note that Armenians refer to the ancient homeland on the west side of the river Arax, which divides what was Western Armenia and Eastern Armenia. They refer to it as Western Armenia, but for those listening and don't know Armenia, might automatically think that it's the western part of Armenia, but it isn't. It's actually, now it's known as Eastern Anatolia in Turkey, but before that it was Armenian territory proper, Western Armenia. There were 6 regions there, and many Armenian villages, although they were mixed with Kurds and other Muslims. They lived side by side until the genocide. But that is Western Armenia. So it was only during, I mean, there were lots of massacres starting from the late 19th century, 1894, right through to 1909, before the First World War, before the genocide that we all refer to. So the massacres had started well before the genocide, with anything up to 300,000 murdered. And then the genocide started when the Young Turks got into power, the 3 of them, the Young Turks, and they saw the Armenians as a threat, because at the time there were 2.5 million Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. That could have been anywhere, sort of Austria or whatever the Ottoman Empire was. But outside that area, especially in Russian-occupied land, as it were, like Ukraine and Russia itself, there were more. So that was the problem, or that they homed in on that there were Armenians on the Russian side that could be a threat on Turkey. That was the excuse they used. So
if we can just go back before we talk about the rise of the Young Turks and the First World War and what led up to the Armenian Genocide, what was life like for Armenians living under the influence of the Islamic Ottoman Empire, particularly the Turks who conquered the area known as Armenia back in the 11th century, and how then life was extremely difficult for Armenians, probably living under what is known as the jizya tax?
It was difficult. For some it was very rewarding, but we'll talk about the difficult side first. A Christian could not give witness, or the witness did not count in court. They paid additional taxes. They didn't have rights the way the Muslims had for land and so on. So they were suppressed. They were second-class citizens. So that was the hard part. But the good part was that there were some revered Armenians in Istanbul or Constantinople at the time that designed a lot of the wonderful palaces. The Balyan family, the architects, are well known. And when you go to Istanbul now, they'll say, oh, that building was, palace was by the Armenian architect. So they're very open about it. So there were 2 sides, but there's only a few that were privileged, had benefits of the Ottoman rules, as opposed to the ones who were subservient.
Absolutely. So if we kind of move on to the 19th century, we saw really that the Ottoman Empire in its heyday in the 15th century kind of dominated the entire Middle East, North Africa, held islands and nations like Cyprus and Malta. We also know that the Ottoman Empire then moved up, controlled the Balkans region, and there's also that famous battle for Vienna as well. That was the Ottoman Empire in its heyday, but come the 19th century, we see the emergence of the European powers, namely Britain and France, that were empowered by the Industrial Revolution, and we started to see the kind of decline of the Ottoman Empire, and I think its nickname was then, when Lord Salisbury was Prime Minister in the 1890s, it was referred to as the sick man of Europe. But show us how this led to the rise, particularly the influence of the Young Turks, who wanted to modernize Turkey and really bring it into the kind of what was then the 19th century.
Well, all of the demise of the Ottoman Empire obviously did not go down well with Sultan Abdul Hamid II. He was being mocked abroad as a sick man of Europe, but also at home because he'd failed and he was in the overall rule of the Ottoman Empire at the time. So he was in a very bad way, and because of that, and listening to some grumblings by other Turks, Ottoman Turks, that it's the fault of the Armenians and other Christians because they're obviously on the side of the West, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on, and they are the enemies. So he decided he had to do something, maybe he was advised or it was his own decision, and that's when all these massacres started. 1894, the first one in Sassoon, and right up to 1909 in Adana. So that was the lead up. This is before the Young Turks really got on the bandwagon, as it were. But the Young Turks got onto the bandwagon because they saw that the populace, not just the Christians, populace were fed up with the Sultan. He'd failed them. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed, and then the Young Turks got in, and they actually tried to draw up a treaty with the West, with Russia, France and Britain, and they were rebuffed, and so that annoyed them, and that led them to side with Germany, and then they entered the First World War as allies.
Ara, please share what happened to your grandmother Mary, who survived the massacre carried out by Sultan Hamid II, which over 100,000 Armenians were murdered brutally at the hands of the Ottoman Empire.
Well, the stories that she recounted were obviously her take on what happened, because she was handed into a German convent by her parents as a baby, and for safekeeping, but knowing that possibly they might never see her again. She was obviously the youngest in the family. And she never did see her parents again, but at least her parents' surnames and names and surnames were recorded by the convent. And she grew up in the convent, and she did very well. She learnt a few languages, including German. And then she was introduced to a young Armenian shepherd boy, married, and they started farming, or he was a farmer or shepherd, near Adana. So in between that period, I'm not too sure, but all I know is that she did survive the Armenian massacres as a baby.
Wow, and that must have been a huge sacrifice on behalf of her parents, your great grandparents, to actually sacrifice their daughter to give them to a kind of missionary, so that they knew that she would be protected, but they might not be.
It was a huge sacrifice, yes, and I've tried to trace this convent, and sadly I can't. I know that there were German convents and missionaries in the Western Armenia, Eastern Anatolia area, but to actually locate and whether the convent still exists has been very difficult.
Yeah. And Ara, just also, as we're discussing the Armenian genocide, that prior to the First World War, the Armenian population throughout the whole of the Ottoman Empire was 2.5 million. Share with us how the Armenian community was spread out across the Ottoman Empire, but you also had the intelligentsia, the academics, even Armenian politicians who were based in the capital, Istanbul, at the time.
Well, I think you've covered it, because the intellectuals and architects like Balyan, who designed the palace, the Sultan's palaces, they all lived in what was Constantinople at the time, now Istanbul. And so they led a different life, if you like, not bourgeoisie, but quite well off, merchants with all the ships coming in through Bosphorus into Istanbul. But on the other hand, what was Western Armenia, Eastern Anatolia, they were shepherds, and they were just peasants working on the lands, you know, and sharing their homeland with Kurds and other Muslims at the time. So it's quite a difference between the two, but they encompassed the whole of what was at the time Turkey, the whole of that large, vast area.
And Ara, would you agree that when the Young Turks carried out a coup against the Sultan and took power and control of the Ottoman Empire in 1913, that they had a racist ideology of purifying the Ottoman Empire and ridding it of ethnic minorities like Armenians and other Christian minorities?
Well, I think they came on a high wave, because a lot of minorities thought, oh, this is wonderful, we're going to be liberated from the harsh treatment we received under Sultan Hamid and his predecessors, because they're enlightened, they're young, they're speaking our language about, you know, freedom and so on. So the initial feelings were good and positive. But then slowly but surely the ideology of the Young Turks started to manifest, and that's when they realized that there was trouble brewing.
Yeah, and also share with us how when, for example, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on behalf of Germany and the Central Powers, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, when they went to war against the British and the French and the Russians, how they saw this as an opportunity to carry out the biggest massacre against Christians in history.
I think a lot of it was to regain prestige in the world, because they had been labelled the sick man of Europe, and this was their chance as ally of Germany, First World War, to actually show their clout and their might, and therefore who to turn within their vast territory but the minorities. And they put a lot of blame on the Christians. It wasn't just Armenians, it was been Assyrians and Greeks. And probably Jews at the time as well, because there were lots of Jews in Izmir, for example. And that way that galvanized other Turks to rally around and say, yes, it must be them that's caused the demise of the Ottoman Empire. And they also got the Kurds on board as well. So that was the start, if you like, just building up this hatred. They obviously had lots of secret plans behind the scenes. And then, of course, they started carrying out their deadly plan to eradicate, you know, all minorities, but the Armenians were the highest, from 2.5 million in the Ottoman Empire, up to 90% disappeared, lost.
Horrific. And Ara, just share with us how the justification used by the Young Turks during the First World War, really citing, trying to give evidence and convincing the Muslim population of the Ottoman Empire that the Armenians posed as a fifth column, that they would align themselves with the enemies of the Ottoman Empire. That was Russia, and this was the excuse that was used to start the massacre against the Armenian people during the First World War.
They sowed that ideology to the masses, saying that, you know, there are lots of Armenians living in Russia, and they will side with the Russian army to fight us. They have done in the past. There were plenty of Russo-Turkish wars, And so there was a threat was going to come from Russia, and therefore Armenians could not be trusted, even though, like my step-grandfather, if you like, who lost his life, he would have been sent to fight on the frontier with Russia, but with no arms. So they were just cannon fodder. So that way, I think the Muslims and the Turks were persuaded that they were enemies of the state, not to be trusted, and the only way really was to get rid of them physically. The Kurds were also bought into this ideology.
Yeah. So according to Britannica, Armenian soldiers and other non-Muslims in the army, this was during the First World War, were demolished and transferred into Labour battalions. They disarmed the Armenian soldiers when they systematically were murdered by the Ottoman troops, the first victims of what would become the genocide. Share with us how this was a deliberate attempt on behalf of the Ottoman state to ensure that the Armenian community, Christian community, would not be protected or would not be able to take up arms in self-defense in defending their Christian communities.
Well, it was obviously a well thought out ploy, wasn't it? I mean, if you disarm soldiers, whatever side they're on, then they are they're there to be slaughtered, and the Armenians were perfect target to actually put into the front line, and thereby someone else did the murder, and the Russians killed them or whatever, and it wasn't the Turks themselves, so they could shrug their shoulders and say it wasn't us. It was the Russians who killed our soldiers, and not differentiating between Muslim and Christian soldiers, as it were. So I think it was a well thought out plan, a very evil one, but very well thought out.
And share with us how the date, April the 24th, 1915, marks the start of the Armenian Genocide, primarily because we saw then that the Young Turks rounded up the academics, they rounded up the professionals in Istanbul, together with the Armenian legislators in the parliament in Istanbul as well. And why did they decide to round up the professionals, the academics, and then start murdering the academics belonging to the Armenian community?
Well, my honest opinion is that if you can get rid of the head, then the body remains weak and dies. So by getting rid of the head, the think tank for the Armenians, those who actually were involved in law, who actually had the voice to say, we are being attacked or whatever, if that was to go first, then remember, it wasn't the days of media and instant access to news. The rest of the Armenians spread across right into eastern Anatolia would not have heard the news for some time. So they would then have had time to, having got rid of the lot in Constantinople, to move across country eastwards, east-northeast, to actually start the extermination program of the remaining Assyrians, Armenians and Greeks.
Yeah, and share with us the very disturbing means that the Ottoman Turks used to carry out the massacre against your people.
I've heard some horrendous stories, not just from my grandmother, but from other diasporan Armenians who have stories from their ancestors. I mean, some of them I wouldn't want to repeat here on the program, but to put it mildly, young girls were totally abused and then killed or mutilated. Young boys and girls were taken by families when they were on the march. They would just go and take them, and many were brought up, as I'm sure many of the viewers know, and then many years on, like 20 years ago, whatever, they started doing DNA tests, and they found that a lot of Turks found out that they were actually of Armenian descent. And the rest, the women, were either raped or allowed to die just of starvation and thirst. But a lot on the journey through the Syrian desert, there's a famous river and a bridge where many Armenian mothers threw themselves in with their children. Things were so desperate. They could see the writing on the wall, and they didn't want to face any more horrors at the hands of the soldiers.
And share with us also, which I think is also very important as it's related to the Holocaust as well, that happened another couple of decades on from the Armenian Genocide, the mass deportation of Armenians from their homelands, driving them into, putting them in concentration camps near the desert, starvations, the walks, the marches through the heat of the desert with no food, with no water, essentially that would lead to their deaths. Just share with us how barbaric and how evil these practices were that were carried out by the Turks, that were also being monitored by German officers during the First World War.
There was a bit of surveillance being carried out or noted by the West, as it were. So although they might have seen lots of dead corpses in various places, to actually see them being butchered on a march would have really sent even greater shockwaves around the world. No matter how slow news got around in those days. So by marching them off and saying that we're repatriating them to another land, and thereby, cleansing or making our land safer by not having these threats from the Armenians, they conducted this merciless midsummer, July-August time march through the desert, knowing full well, of course, without water and food they'd perish, so they would just die a normal death, as it were. So that was the plan, but hidden behind all that plan, what could visibly be seen as a march through the desert, lots of villages people were butchered in the churches, they were locked inside the churches and the churches set on fire and so on. So it wasn't just the march through the desert that killed them, there were many other horrendous acts that took place.
Yeah, and historians actually note that between 600,000 and 1 million ethnic Armenians were murdered on those death marches in the deserts in Syria, which I think goes to show the sheer magnitude of terror and evil that was carried out by the Ottoman Turks against your people during the First World War. And just share with us how horrific would have been for mothers with toddlers or elderly people forced to walk on those death marches.
Well, for mothers and toddlers, of course, not only would it have been a physical hardship, carrying one toddler as my grandmother would have done, and perhaps holding the hand of the other one, walking along, and then eventually having to lift both up, and then losing strength and collapsing, and that must have happened to so many young mothers. And for the elderly, I'm sure that within no time at all in that heat, they would have just dropped dead on the spot, from exhaustion or whatever. So that would have been the horrors faced by the Armenians. And of course the men were all in the army or being shot dead elsewhere. But it was mainly the elderly and the women with their children.
So let's see this report put together by our friends at CBN entitled Erasing History, that looked back at the Armenian Genocide, and this report was from 2018.
About 1.5 million Christians were killed in what is now eastern Turkey during World War I. Armenians claim it was part of a deliberate policy of genocide ordered by the Ottoman Turk government. Turkey has denied the charge.
Сегодня для всего армянского народа день скорби, день воспоминания геноцида 1915 года. Это тяжелый день, но я сегодня рад, что народ помнит и будет помнить во все времена.
20 countries, including Germany, Sweden, Russia, and Canada, recognized the acts in 1915 as genocide. 43 U.S. states had done so as well.
So let's all pause and remember and to pray for the Armenian people as they remember the biggest genocide committed against Christians and their community in history, as over 1.5 million Armenians and other Christian minorities were murdered at the hands of the Turks over 110 years ago on the 24th of April 1915. Share with us your story. You shared a little bit in the programme about your family connection to the Armenian genocide, but share with us what happened to your grandmother Mary and her husband, who was the shepherd boy, when the Armenian massacre started to take place during the First World War.
I can recall the age of maybe 4 or 5, Mary sharing her stories with me, and of course there was always floods of tears while she recalled the stories. And the one thing that I couldn't really understand was when she said that young girls were taken away into the hills by the soldiers, and all I could hear was their screaming. I couldn't understand really what that was, but obviously that was sexual abuse. And then talking about, seeing people drop dead, people just not being able to carry on, her own suffering while she was carrying her 2 little ones, until eventually they died. They died of starvation and thirst.
This was on the death marches.
This was on the death marches, and she left them in a cave because years on, archaeologists have found bones of corpses of Armenians in these caves, so it ties in with her story. But she herself actually managed to struggle on, even though she suffered that horror, seeing her 2 little girls die, and then her husband coming back as a soldier, escaped soldier, being shot dead in front of her. And then eventually she was rescued by a British ship, because the French took the refugees to Marseille, the British took them to Alexandria or Port Said in Egypt, and to Khartoum in Sudan, is where she ended up, pro tem, as a refugee in Sudan.
And what impact has this had on your life, Ara, knowing that your family went through this horrific massacre? And what impact does that still have today on the Armenian people?
Well, as far as I was concerned, it had a huge impact, because she would always, after crying and saying, Adana, Adana, because they lived near Adana, where in 1909 there were other massacres, and she would always say, never trust the Turks, never trust the Kurds, they're murderers and so on. So it was all negative. So that had an influence, growing up. If I met a Turk, I would walk away, I wouldn't converse with them. I wouldn't hit them, obviously, not my style, but I certainly wouldn't engage in conversation with them. So that was the effect it had on me until I was born again, and my dear wife Nikki said, how can you be a Christian if you don't uphold Jesus' teachings of love your enemies and forgive and so on? So to cut a long story short, she'd already met a Kurdish-Turkish couple with a baby, and she'd got to know them. She read their newsletter, and then eventually said, why don't you read their newsletter? And I did, and then I went to meet them with Nikki, and it was the first time any Turk or Kurd had asked for forgiveness. And that broke me, completely broke me. So that opened the door to healing, my healing, inner healing, but also for the ministry that I started getting involved with, the healing between Turks, Kurds and the Armenians.
Fabulous. Let's have a look at a Middle East Report archive, and this is an interview that I did with Terry George, the famous Hollywood film director who won an Oscar for his film Hotel Rwanda, and this was on his film that he produced back in 2017 called The Promise, which took 100 years to make, that tells the story of the Armenian Genocide from the Armenian perspective. But you deserve so much credit for having the courage to push through and to make such an incredible film. Can you tell us about the film? Can you tell us where it's set, the time frame, and also the remarkable characters that are involved?
Yeah, it's It's an epic love story. It's set during the outbreak of the First World War in Constantinople, and it involves a young man from a small village, a mixed Armenian Turkish village in the southern region of what was then the Ottoman Empire. He's an apothecary, he's a chemist who has great aspirations to become a doctor. He can't afford the fees for the medical school in Constantinople, what's now Istanbul. And in order to get those fees, he agrees to become betrothed to a woman in his village, and the father will advance the dowry towards his fees. He heads for Constantinople, and there he meets a young Armenian woman, the daughter of an extremely successful Armenian violinist who's been living in Paris, and she's currently in a relationship with an American reporter who's played by Christian Bale. The woman, Anna, played by the French-Canadian actress Charlotte Le Bon, meets up with Mikhail, who's played by Oscar Isaac, and they fall in love. And therefore Mikhail is presented with this dilemma. He's betrothed back in Sarun, the village, and yet he's in love with this woman, Anna. When they're about to come to some decision about what to do, the first big instigating event of the Armenian Genocide, which was the arrest of the Armenian intellectuals throughout Constantinople. 247 of them were arrested on Easter Sunday, April 24th, 1915. And were some of them executed, some forced into exile. And among those arrested is Mikhail's uncle, and he subsequently is also arrested and shipped to a labor camp. And what happened, one of the main features of the genocide, and one particular plan, was that the bulk of the Armenian male population were conscripted into the army, subsequently disarmed, and many of them used in labor camps and massacred or worked to death. You experienced that through Mikhail. He manages to escape, make his way back to the village, and discover the village has changed completely, that the Armenian community is under threat. And then a series of events, he re-meets with Anna and Chris, the American reporter, and eventually he and Anna end up trapped on this mountain, Muzadak, with 4,000 other Armenian refugees. So the story is, it's in the genre of those films that David Lean made, and the great old classical love stories, love dramas set against a big political event. And we use the love story in a way to tell the story of the genocide itself.
And such an important and powerful film, The Promise, and it was an absolute privilege to interview Terry George, the director, but also to go to the premiere and the screening of The Promise. So if you haven't seen it, can I please recommend you go and watch it? It's a brilliant film that will tell the true story of the Armenian Genocide during the First World War at the hands of the Turks, and it'll give you a better understanding of what actually happened over 110 years ago. What was extraordinary is, taking me back a few years there, Ara, was the fact that this film, it took almost 100 years to make, because the Turkish government put huge pressure on the State Department. They put huge pressure on Hollywood and didn't want this film to come out. But thankfully this film came out in 2017 that told of the horrors of the Armenian Genocide, but within the kind of love triangle of a love story, so that this could attract a wider audience to what happened. Share with us why it's so important that people know what happened to the Armenians over 100 years ago.
I think it's important for everyone to know of any genocide, but nowadays, of course, like Rwandan genocide, it's in the press. You know, it's instant. What's happening in Ukraine, for example, it's instant. You get lots of reporting coverage. But for the Armenian genocide, it was such a different story because it was so long ago. And any records of photographs or videos or whatever would have been very scarce, and therefore for them to not only try and overcome all the hurdles that Turkey were throwing in its path, there was the actual, footage of interviewing survivors just to get a better background of what happened and how it happened, because there's so many stories out there. I've read so many stories of survivors of ancestors who suffered, and they've all got a different story to tell of the horrors that they witnessed. So that's why I think it took a long time.
And now, if we just look at the Armenian community after the First World War, we're talking about the decimation of 90% of your nation's population from what was the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, which is truly horrific. Then we had some of the survivors of the Armenian Genocide had to convert to Islam. Many of their homes that they occupied in and their communities they lived in, the new Turkish government literally turfed them out and actually placed lots of Muslim families in there to try and eradicate any kind of existence that the Armenians ever lived in there. So share with us how, for example, it's not only the murder of ethnic Armenians, but it's also attack on your history and also any historical places like churches or towns or communities that they just wanted to literally wipe off the map to show and to tell the world there was never an Armenian community here, to cover up their lies, their evil crimes, and this is a huge sin against your people, the Armenians.
It certainly is a huge sin, and I can take it, the start of it that I'm aware of was the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II himself, who, when he was weakened and called the sick man of Europe and so on, he started instructing all the powers to be never to mention Armenia as a place, no documents, and certainly not verbally, and instead to call Armenia and the Armenians Kurdistan or Anatolia. So it started way back then, and eradication of churches, obviously, language, and any evidence of Armenians having been in Turkey. And there is a mirror of this mirror image happening right now, 110 years on or a bit less, in Azerbaijan, because President Aliyev is trying to tell the world that Armenia has never existed, it's a figment of their imagination, and it's always been Western Azerbaijan, and the churches are not Armenian, they're in fact called Albanian or whatever, something else, just to make sure that all traces of the Armenian language, the Armenian people, disappears into history.
And share with us this remarkable quote made by William Shayaran that really does describe the heart and the spirit of the Armenian people, and how after the horrors of the Armenian Genocide over 110 years ago, how this whole spirit of the Armenian people was captured in this remarkable quote that you made. I'll let you read it out.
Yes,
it's a special quote.
The quote really is taken from a book he wrote. He's very popular. William Shayaran wrote many books, not just about Armenians, but the book that this comes from is called The Armenian and the Armenian, because wherever Armenians meet, and it's a case in point with me, I've met Armenians all around the world, and you immediately have a story to share, usually to do with being a descendant of the diaspora. So you put the world right, you discuss about old times, and you have a laugh and a beer and what have you. But at the very end of the story, of that short story, he came out with this amazing quote. I should like to see any power of the world destroy this race, this small tribe of unimportant people whose history is ended, whose wars have all been fought and lost, whose structures have crumbled, whose literature is unread, whose music is unheard, whose prayers are no longer uttered. Go ahead, destroy Armenia. See if you can do it. Send them from their homes into the desert. Let them have neither bread nor water. Burn their houses and their churches. See if they will not live again. See if they will not laugh again. See if the race will not live again when two of them meet in a beer parlour 20 years later and laugh and speak in their tongue. Go ahead. See if you can do anything about it. See if you can stop them from mocking the big ideas of the world. A couple of Armenians talking in the world. Go ahead and try to destroy them. See if they will not create a new Armenia.
And of course, it did create a new Armenia after the collapse of the Soviet Union back at the end of 1991. I'm talking about this one as well because many people talk about the Holocaust, but they don't see the correlation between the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust that occurred, obviously, in from 1939 right through to 1945, when the Nazis carried out the final solution. But we see that the Armenian genocide was the forerunner for that. I mean, for example, we talk about the death marches. We talk about the mass deportation of people, the starvation of people, putting Armenians and other Christians into caves and setting them alight. All of this was then observed by the German military instructors who were in the Ottoman Empire at the time. And of course, Hitler wrote that famous letter to the heads of the German SS and the German Wehrmacht before they launched their invasion into Poland in September, on the 1st of September 1939, where he told them, do not be afraid of committing massacres, because after all, who remembers the Armenians?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. And in Washington, the Holocaust Museum, in fact, in 1939, there's a placard. There was a placard put up with that quote on brass. So it was for the world to see that it was commemorating the Holocaust, which was ghastly in itself, but also that Hitler was referring back to this Armenian, who remembers the Armenians? In other words, if they got away with it that time, then we can get away with it again.
And Ara, how will yourself and other Armenians living in Armenia, but also around the world, be marking the 110th anniversary of the start of the Armenian genocide?
Well, thankfully this year we shall be there, my wife and I, we shall be there to join in the march up to Nagorno-Karabakh, it's called. It's a monument with 12 pylons that represent the 12 areas in Western Armenia where Armenians were slaughtered, and within which the monument, there's an eternal flame that never goes out, obviously depicting that the Armenian spirit will never, no matter what, as William Sarahan said, you'll never destroy the Armenian race. So we'll be going up there, but I want to just focus on the name. Nagorno-Karabakh means a swallow's fortress, and it was called a swallow's fortress because the swallows will always return to their nests even if their homes are destroyed. So that is the connection between the name and this powerful monument to all Armenians. And many dignitaries, 2 popes in the past have laid wreaths there and flowers. Others have planted trees, so 32 countries do recognize the genocide officially, but sadly some don't.
And just share with us how important it is for the Armenian community to get that international recognition that the genocide took place, but also the fact that Turkey also needs to come to terms with its dark and evil past to acknowledge its role in the genocide against your people during the First World War, and how they are doing everything to actually stop any discussion on the Armenian genocide that took place back in the First World War.
I think you're right. For Armenians, it's not a case of just ticking the box and saying, oh, there's another country, hooray. Although, of course, with Biden acknowledging it officially as genocide was a huge coup, if you like, for the Armenians, but for Turkey it was a huge nail in their coffin. And I can only put it down to the fact that, one, they're very proud people, and they don't like forgiving, at all. Not all of them, as I recounted, some Turks and Kurds have asked for forgiveness to me personally. And they don't want to have to pay out compensation and maybe even handing lands back. They don't want that.
Germany had to. Germany had to after the Second World War, after the Nazis murdered over 6 million Jewish people on the industrial scale during the final solution. And that was the only way to bring, for example, Germany back into the fold. And yet today, Turkey is a NATO member, has been a NATO member since 1952, and has never had to pay a price for the Armenian genocide, and even threatens nations that actually recognise the Armenian genocide.
Well, I think the big difference is that Germany was surrounded by nations who didn't accept and didn't want to, and pressurised them to acknowledge the Holocaust and pay compensation for it. Turkey is not surrounded by nations like that, because Russia doesn't give a tuppence about it, and other countries around, they don't, they might say, okay, there was a genocide, but so what, it was so long ago. We're not going to pressurise Turkey, and Turkey is still regarded as a big player in NATO, and doing peace deals between Ukraine and Russia and Libya, you name it. Erdogan's played a very clever game in making sure that Turkey remains a very key player in the region, and therefore no one's going to pressurise Turkey the way they did Germany.
And if we kind of bring ourselves up to date, and thankfully the Armenian people have their nation again. We saw that with the downfall of the Soviet Union, where Armenia gained its independence and gained its sovereignty again. But share with us how your people, the Armenian people, faced another genocide only recently, back at the end of September 2023, when Azerbaijani forces forced more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians out of their ancient homeland and their churches, known as Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, and also committed massacres and murders against the Armenian people. And yet the world is silent regarding this new genocide against your people.
That's another nail in the Armenians' coffin, really, because what started 110 years ago and before that, the Hamidian massacres, is still continuing, but in an easterly direction, as it were, in Azerbaijan. And so for the Armenians, it was incredibly hurtful, especially the sort of broadcasting to the world that Armenia really never belonged here. They haven't got a history here. They're just, usurpers, sort of recent arrivals, when all Armenians know that the churches were built there over 1,500 years ago. There's lots of trace of Armenian culture in what is Artsakh. And so when the world stood still and did almost nothing, there were voices raised, of course, the churches raised their voices, but the UK, for example, where we live, did virtually nothing. And that we all know, it's so well known, is because BP has all the oil interests in Baku and makes a fortune out of the profits. And BP wasn't going to do anything, and of course the government wasn't going to rock BP's boat. So that also hurts Armenians living in the UK, that no matter how much pressure, we as Armenian UK citizens put on Parliament, they did absolutely.
And also share with us the plight of the political prisoners that were taken as prisoners back to kind of Baku in Azerbaijan, who are being denied access by the Red Cross, no doubt being tortured. We don't know what their plight is, we don't know what their health is, and yet again the international community is silent. And what's even worse is that the Formula One Grand Prix actually have a racing course that goes right past the prison in Baku, and yet it was only the Armenian community that opposed the Grand Prix being hosted by Azerbaijan. They've also hosted the UN Climate Summit as well, and yet the world is silent when it comes to the crimes committed by the Azeris.
It is astonishing, isn't it? But politics never fails to astound me. I mean, the hypocrisy of politics. I mean, there are good politicians, but in that case, it was horrendous, you know, and it still is. These prisoners are there. They won't get a fair trial. The EU knows it, but they still need the gas and oil from Azerbaijan, so they don't do much. Maybe a sort of a complaint here and there. But the one thing I want to point out also that you didn't mention was the Eurovision Song Contest. There they were singing loud and clear about love and freedom and everything that all the countries in the Eurovision Song Contest like to sing about. And yet, where is the love in Azerbaijan? It's just, you know, the regime cracks down on its own people as well as poor Armenian prisoners.
Absolutely. So we definitely need to keep them in our prayers, that those prisoners will come home who want to see their loved ones, they want to see their families, and yet not even being allowed access by the Red Cross to actually see how they are and their well-being. In summing up, how would you describe or see the Armenian massacre of the First World War, which over 1.5 million Armenians and other Christian ethnic minorities were brutally murdered at the hands of the Ottoman Turks, and be able to see this through a biblical prism?
Well, through a biblical prism, I would say that there was a lot of envy by the Ottoman government, the Sultan, etc., because of the success the Armenians had. And the fact that their faith was strong, you know, they were churchgoers and so on. And so I looked up the biblical references, which I know anyway, and there are lots of cases in the Old Testament of Cain and Abel and so on, and Saul and David as well. But the most powerful one was from Proverbs 14, verse 30. A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. I think
that's a brilliant way to end the programme. You've been absolutely superb, Ara, on the Middle East Report today. Thank you so much for coming in and telling your story and the story of the Armenian people. And I just want to thank you for watching this programme at home. We need to pray for Armenia. We need to pray for the Armenian people, and their story needs to be heard, and it has been heard on the Middle East Report. So thank you for watching today's programme. God bless.